Hello, my name is Jack Davey. I'm the managing editor of the Journal of Korean Studies. And the journal comes to you from the George Washington University Institute for Korean Studies. And I'm excited to bring to you the very first installment of the journal's Author Spotlight series, which introduces the authors behind our articles. And I'm joined today by Dr. Paul Cha, who is an assistant professor of Korean Studies and Modern Korean History at the University of Hong Kong. And he authored the article, People Like You and Me, The Korean War, Humanitarian Aid, and Creating Compassion, which was published in the spring 2021 issue. So welcome, Dr. Cha.
Thank you for having me. Really excited
Thank you.
to be here. Yes.
Yes, I can't think of a better person to start off this series with. So, Dr. Cha, I really thought your article was a fascinating look into an aspect of post-war South Korean reconstruction that we really don't give much consideration for, what you term the role of private and voluntary humanitarian aid organizations from the US. And I think your article really does a really wonderful job of speaking not only to how and why these organizations operated, but also highlight some of the longer term and perhaps more negative consequences of the way these groups portrayed South Koreans for a US audience. So I'd like to begin by just asking you if you could tell us a bit about your research generally and how you came to this topic.
All right. Thank you for that question. So I'm a specialist of modern Korean history, and my particular topic examines Protestantism in Korea. And this particular article itself was sort of an accident, right? That fortuitous accident that I had, or encounter I had in the archives. So as I was finishing up some final research for my forthcoming book, Balancing Communities, I traveled to the World Council of Churches archives. And while I was there, an archivist happened to mention that they recently completed a new collection on peace, reconciliation, and reunification of the Korean Peninsula. And so I decided, why not take a look? And I was just amazed. First of all, there are boxes upon boxes upon boxes related to the activities of the international Christian community in South Korea from about late 1950s to the early 2000s. And so as I'm going through these files, one of the questions that I had was, why was the international Christian community so concerned and involved in South Korea? I mean, when I'm talking about the international Christian community, predominantly Protestant, it wasn't just Americans and Europeans. We had groups from East Asia, Japan and Taiwan, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and also non-aligned countries such as Cuba. So what accounted for this? And since I'm an historian, I put on my historian hat and I went through the archives and went back and back and back. And eventually I came to the Korean War. And I would argue that the Korean War had a qualitative and a quantitative impact in how the international Christian community engaged the Korean Peninsula. So up to 1950, Korea is dominated by the major Protestant mission societies from the US. Right? So we've got the Presbyterians and the Methodists. But after 1950, as I detail in the article, the international community is really focused on what's happening on the Korean Peninsula. And as a result, we have this massive influx, sudden influx of other Protestant organizations in Korea. And so there's this quantitative explosion in terms of this interest by the Christian community, but it's also qualitative because these groups are no longer predominantly concerned about conversion and church growth. They're really concerned with humanitarian aid. So there's this qualitative also sort of change in how the international Christian community is becoming involved in Korea at this point. Now, that being said, even though we had this interest on the part of these organizations, these PVOs, private voluntary aid organizations, this doesn't mean that the general American population wants to contribute aid to Korea, right? So if you're reading these files, it's quite clear that these organizations are really struggling with this issue of how can we convince Americans to go beyond just simple pity for Korea to actually feeling a sense of solidarity to the point of having compassion for these Koreans and then to contribute money. And that therein lies the thrust of what I was trying to argue or examine in the article.
Yes, thanks very much for going into that. I really also like your theoretical invention of talking about, well, how do we move from pity or a human reaction to images or depictions of suffering to then go to actually, donation and humanitarian aid. So yeah, I thought your article was really interesting, delving into that aspect of it as well. So what would you say are the most important or interesting takeaways from your article that you think, especially the Korean studies audience, should be taking note of?
Right. Jack, I think on one level, you already mentioned, I think the real big point were the long-term sort of negative impact of this messaging. And I think that's one of the critical points that I really wanted to hit upon and emphasize in that conclusion. But there's several other takeaways in the article, some that are more readily apparent and some that are a little more subtle. And I actually want to bring out one of the subtle points first. So yeah, I just mentioned that the origins of this project was the World Council of Churches Archives. And there's obviously in the article this idea that South Korea is a Christian nation standing up against the forces of communism, and thus Americans should support South Korea. So there's a Christian element to the article. But at the same time, just going through all these different files and taking an examination of what these PVOs are actually doing, this Christian messaging is a bit subdued, right? Surprisingly. So it's not so blatant as to make the argument that you are Christian and therefore you should devote money to South Korea. We don't really see that in these advertisements. And that's because these PVOs don't really care if the donors are Christian, right? It doesn't matter if you're Catholic, if you're Protestant, if you're secular, if you're Jewish. The only thing that they're worried about and really concerned about is if they can raise money for the relief and rehabilitation of South Korea. And so keeping that in mind, America is changing in the post-war era, post-World War II era. It's becoming more secular. Catholics who historically had been persecuted and discriminated against in the US, they're becoming more prominent in public social and political life in the US. There's increasing Jewish population, right? So American religiosity is changing in the post-World War II era. So if you want to craft a message that reaches the widest basis of American society as possible, you need to sort of tone down that sort of Christian argument that only Christians should devote and contribute money. Now, so if I was to abstract a principle of what this means for scholars, when we examine sort of the US and South Korean relationship, especially at a societal level, we have to go beyond a lot of our assumptions, right? We have to really take a micro-historical approach and really dig deep and understand what exactly is happening in the US at that point. And so one of the things that I often see in scholarship is that the US was Christian, is Christian America. And that's sort of, you said it's a shorthand to explain why the US or Americans became involved in South Korea in these types of projects. But in fact, America is changing, right? And even Christian America, that category encompasses a wide range of denominations and beliefs, and also is in many sense imagined also. So that's the subtle sort of takeaway that I think is important. Another takeaway from the article is that we really also need to pay attention to private voluntary aid organizations, right? So on the one hand, they shaped in how a lot of Americans understood and perceived South Korea. South Korea being a land lacking able-bodied men, full of war widows, right, and full of home to many, many helpless Korean orphans, right? And so the lasting impacts of that. But there is a flip side to that. And the flip side of the coin is these PVOs actually have boots on the ground in South Korea. So if you're a Korean person, and especially if you live outside of a major metropolitan area, or you don't live close to a camp town, most likely if you meet a Westerner, that Westerner has some sort of connection with one of these PVOs, right? Because these PVOs are sending a great deal of personnel to the country. And so, and these sort of interactions are not always benign, right? So a lot of these people, Koreans, they view these workers as sort of racist discrimination, right? And there's a lot of complaints of how this humanitarian aid is being distributed in the country. So there are two sides of the coins here. So the article really focuses on how Americans perceive Korea, but there's this other aspect to it that also needs to be examined. Now, the final takeaway, I'll just give you three for today. I want to go to this idea that the Korean War was a forgotten war in the United States. Now, I'm not going to argue against that, but I would want to make a slight maybe correction, right? Even if the Korean War was a forgotten war in the United States, the humanitarian crisis that it produced wasn't. And these organizations continued to send aid to South Korea well into the 1970s. And August 15th, National Liberation Day, I think is translated into English, was just a couple weeks ago. And I just, as a result of that, I happened to meet a man, an elderly gentleman, and he was talking about his childhood and him growing up in California. And he mentioned that he remembers as a child that they would hold weekly offerings in Sunday school to aid South Korean war orphans. And this is after the signing of the armistice in 1953. So he thinks he was about 5 or 6, and so it was probably about 1958 to 1960. And this is not like aberration. So these organizations are continually to send aid. And so in this manner, the Korean War and the humanitarian crisis that it produced lived on. And so there's that aspect that I think we need to sort of pay attention to as scholars.
Yeah, thank you so much for going into that. I was actually also struck by that last point you made, that, yeah, that this continued for so long, even if the impetus was initially the Korean War and the post-war reconstruction, as you say. Yeah, I was so surprised to learn about that. Yeah, well, given that you said you came to this topic almost by accident or
Right.
fortuitously, despite that, you've really opened up, I think, a really rich vein for future analysis. So I would like to ask you now, where either do you plan to go following this direction, or where do you hope other scholars will go with the base you've established here?
All right. So where I plan to go with this article is actually one of the first steps in my second book project that I'm currently working on, which examines how South Korea and the Korean Peninsula became a nexus for a global religious Cold War. So one sort of recent sort of trend in Cold War studies is to reemphasize the importance of religion. So for example, when we look at the United States, scholars have noted that political leaders, in particular Dwight Eisenhower and his administration, they leveraged this idea that the Soviet Union was this communist country that was atheist, and that it was bent not only on destroying the United States and democracy, but also religious freedom and Christianity in particular. And how this rhetoric was then used to mobilize Americans to fight against the Soviets. So what my project does, or my second book, is to examine how this rhetoric was actually put into practice outside of the US, in countries like South Korea, where the Cold War wasn't cold, right? It turned into a hot fighting conflict. So there was different stakes involved for people living in Korea than in the United States. So this is what the second book is, and I could get into more detail, right, if you want, but that's just a broad sketch. But I think there are other areas that this article can push scholars into. For example, I think, once again, one of my interests in this particular topic, the original interest where I was going to go with it, was to explain sort of this involvement of these international Christian groups in South Korea, in particular during the 1970s, during the human and labor rights conflicts, right? So how these Christian organizations, when we think about Christianity in Korea, usually we think of it in terms of, Korean Christians are very conservative theologically, and they eschew sort of participating in politics, right? But then how do we understand the 1970s, where some of these Christian organizations actually became the conduit that allowed human and labor rights protests to continue during that dark decades and under political oppression? Well, I think part of it is we need to understand these networks that were established in the 1950s and 60s through these humanitarian aid organizations. And so that's one area that I would like to see the scholarship go. I don't know if I'll actually go that direction, because I find this Cold War stuff a little more interesting right now. But I think that's also another sort of fruitful area of research for scholars, whether it's myself or for others.
Great. Yeah, I'm certainly excited to read whatever you come up with next, either in your book or where this eventually takes you. But with that, I think I'll bring this interview to a close. Thank you again, Dr. Cha, so much for devoting your time and expertise and sharing your research with us.
All right, thank you. Thanks.
Yep. If I would like to say to everyone watching, if you would like to read Dr. Cha's article, if you haven't already, please make sure to visit the journal's website and give us a follow on Twitter and Facebook while you're at it. And details of those can be found in the description of this video. So thank you all for watching, and please stay tuned to the Journal of Korean Studies for more author spotlight interviews. Thank you very much.